So again, good afternoon. My name is Lucy Beednell. I'm the Director of Advocacy for the ARC of Northern Virginia, and we are very excited to have you here with us today. All of the time, we get calls from parents, especially who have children with disabilities, navigating special education, confused, overwhelmed, hearing and reading that inclusive classrooms are best practices, but not really understanding how that would work for their child, or if they go to a segregated classroom, do they later move back to inclusive? And how do we navigate this tricky world of inclusive services? And just anecdotally, I will say for those folks listening here today, we've seen kids, regardless of the severity of their disability, be very successful in inclusive settings, but it's not just the education piece. In my experience, kids who are included in classroom settings are our first folks to demand integrated inclusive employment and integrated affordable accessible housing, right? And so they go out into life with an expectation of being included in their community, and gosh darn it, they make it happen. They are our trailblazers, right? It's those amazing attitudes of, well, I've done something like this before, I'll just make it happen again, that make really wonderful things happen. So I am elated to have an actual expert on this subject here today, Liz Capone, who's a special education advocate, here to share her wisdom with us. So without further ado, Liz, we are so excited to have you back. Thank you for joining us, and please take it away.
Thank you all so much for having me today. And I'm not a big read slide person, but I do refer to the slides from time to time, and I'll be scrolling on my phone as you're moving them along. Just a little bit about my background and how I came to reflect and feel that this is such an important topic. I am still a certified special educator in Virginia. I last taught in Fairfax County when I was still teaching. I have taught in 6 local school systems, so I'm also still a certified. I maintain teaching certification in Maryland and Virginia. I taught for 21 years in 6 different school systems at all grade levels at various levels of placement. And coming from the perspective of being raised by a child psychologist who would often bring neighborhood children home randomly for free and offer some reading tutoring at the kitchen table for parents raised in that environment. Also, the other parent, my father was a philosophy professor, among other things. So I'm always reflecting and thinking. So as we start our desired outcomes for today for everybody, we're going to talk about some assumptions about inclusion, some barriers, and some tips to help it work. And I think before I start about inclusion, I don't think we would have inclusion if we didn't have exclusion. And that sounds kind of obvious and kind of a no-brainer, but really it's sort of like when we define a word and what is inclusion, and I was thinking all the different words that pop into my brain, whether it's belonging or acceptance or welcoming. You know, think of a circle and a student walking into a class, and maybe they're coming in late and the teacher already has an activity and all the students are standing in a circle. If you can picture that, we want that circle opened up, and we want whatever student, whomever, to come in and be included and be a part, and visually to know they're part of that. And also the other students, we want them to visualize, oh, Jimmy, Sally, LaShawn, they're part of our group. We're included. I remember a very distinct memory in my middle school, which was then, I'm not going to date myself, called junior high. And I remember a group of students walking down the hall, going downstairs. And I remember thinking, what's downstairs? I've never been downstairs. And somebody's like, oh, there's a classroom down by the boiler room. And I didn't know who those students were. And I didn't eat lunch with those students. I didn't have phys ed with those students. I didn't know their names. Fast forward a few years later into my high school experience, I was running varsity track. Thankfully, I was very successful at it. And there was a familiar face, a girl from that group that had walked away. She was now actually a competitor for another school some miles away, but she had moved, was in a different county, and was doing very, very well in varsity track. Long story short, she won the state championship for Class D in the 2-mile the following year as part of regular, varsity track, nothing separate about it. And I remember thinking later, what if she had been in my PE class? Because she and I were sort of rivals. And I remember the track coach coming to me one day and said, let's just call her Sally. Sally got your letter, because we knew she was going to state. So I went and got all of our members of the track team to write her a good luck card. And she was walking around her school saying, Liz, my maiden name's Moran, Liz Moran gave me a good luck letter. But I had never had the chance to be in class with her in junior high. And so I think about that as something that's really left a mark on me. I wasn't even given the opportunity to be in PE with her. We could have been running together in junior high. We could have been running together and learning about each other, but I was never given the opportunity. So with that sort of perspective of what are we missing when we aren't including certain students, let's go forward with the outcomes for today. Like I said, the outcomes, if you wouldn't mind me sharing, we have 3, which are to understand assumptions, because when you're at that IEP table and people are talking about inclusion, what is and what isn't possible, it's really helpful to understand what people are assuming. And those assumptions obviously influence the barriers, and there are some crossover or overlap between those 2 terms, and we'll get into that. And then, of course, I'm all about problem solving and making improvements and seeing what we can do to make it work. But we really, for this topic, have to understand some of the biases and beliefs people are bringing to the table, whether it's a conversation they're having in the staff lounge or something they, read online, that staff in that IEP meeting has some assumptions. If we could go to the next slide, please. So my sort of, I get it, I guess the best word is offended. I get offended when some school staff, either I've worked with them or I've been in an advocate situation, they're predetermining a student's potential for accessing the gen ed curriculum. And I didn't abbreviate it with dots, but I understand gen ed curriculum. And I almost think, why is it the default category for students not on an IEP to be in general ed, and why is it sometimes the default setting for students with an educational disability to not be in general ed? And it comes down to some assumptions. People think, well, the curriculum will move at a different pace. There is a smaller group. There are more staff in that room. The room isn't as overwhelming, et cetera, et cetera. And I think about, what could we do to replicate some of those things that are happening in that other setting, in the general ed setting, to make it work and make it welcoming for all students. And how can we do that? Can we have small groups set up? Can we have the furniture changed? It's really interesting when we talk about space. And I did a lot of reflecting. We'll get to space in a minute. But when a teacher sets up spaces, whether it's centers or whether it's a conference style desk, or the desks are conference style, or whether they're in rows on a diagonal, or whether they're in little clumps of groups, the teacher is thinking about instruction and about assessment. It's very interesting when we do assessment and we have standardized testing. It's very specific. Their students are in rows, their desks have to be so many feet apart, they're all facing a certain way. That's assessment mode for SOLs, etc. But when you think about instruction, it's different groupings. Teachers have a lot of flexibility. So when we think about that, when they're like, oh, they need to be in a small class size, let's really stop and think about what's going on in a small class and what we can bring over and go, oh, well, we can do that in general ed. Oh, they need additional staff support, we can do that in general ed. Look at what I have in yellow, the LRE requirement in IDEA. It's in the forms. What services and supports can we put in place so that the student can remain in the general ed setting in their neighborhood school as their first option? Think about that. Think about different supports, whether it's visual organizers, whether it's behavior reminders, whether it is a visual of the schedule. A lot of those things, and we'll talk about UDL in a minute, Those help every student. Every student benefits. I mean, if you're sitting in a training and you have a poster that tells you when we're starting, when we're breaking, and when we're finishing, that's beneficial to me. That would be beneficial to any adult in a training session. Why wouldn't that be beneficial to a student? So we talk about all of sort of those, I don't want to be flippant, magical things that are going on in those other rooms. We can go in there and go, oh, why don't we do this? Why don't we have a small group setting in the back of the room? Why don't we have 3 different small groups? Why don't we rotate and do stations? So think about those assumptions of what we can't do in general ed, but they can do in another setting, and how we can sort of transport some of those and bring those in and import them into general ed. Next slide, please. And this is one that I really have heard in the staff lounge, and I'm sure you've heard this, and maybe not, maybe you haven't heard it in an IEP meeting. One of the big assumptions, time. That is a huge one. Well, we would be able to do all these adaptations to the curriculum, but it takes too much time. We would be able to take that lesson on, wants and needs in the economy or multiplication. We would be able to do adaptations, but it takes too much time. We would be able to modify that art lesson with some more sensory friendly materials, but it takes too much time. So I really was reflecting, like I said, I'm a big why person. Like, okay, what else takes too much time? Let's pause for a minute and think about what else takes a lot of time, but people don't just throw it out and go, we can't do that. That takes too much time. Next slide, please. I was an SGA advisor in more than one building at more than one grade level, and I did that for a couple reasons. I did that as a way for me to be seen from children who were on an IEP as somebody who worked with children who weren't on an IEP. So that was one of my ways to be more inclusive as a staff member, to have students access what I was, working on, whether it was an SGA program or a bulletin board. I wanted students on IEPs and not on IEPs to say, oh, that's Miss Capone. I know her from SGA. Oh, I know her from Resource, because you don't want the students necessarily to be like, oh, well, why do you know Miss Capone? Do you get reading help from her? You want to have students be empowered and not have self-esteem issues about working with a special ed teacher. That was my belief anyway. So some of the things that I've seen and worked and helped with, or helped a coworker with, that take a lot of time, and this is just an aside, and this is sort of a compare and contrast, that take a lot of time, but nobody ever says we can't do this because it takes a lot of time. Let me just tell you some of the things that take a lot of time. Planning Spirit Week. I took over from one SGA advisor one year. The prior year, we actually started the prior year, planning the theme, ordering materials, picking the dates, etc. It takes a lot of time. Field trips. Teachers will tell you there are forms. You have to get the bus. You have to get the asthma forms. You have to make sure there are enough chaperones. You have to collect, fees if you have to contact the venue. You have to, all of those things. Homecoming, whether it's high school, sometimes they have them at younger grades, but mainly it's high school. It takes so much time, every last detail. Holiday concerts, I've helped coworkers plan those, whether it's I did the banner one year, whether it's setting up, practice time if students need to be, stay late, come to lunch late because they were rehearsing. Again, you never ever hear anybody go, we can't do Spirit Week next year because it takes too much time. So the whole, oh, we can't do inclusion, we can't do those practices, we just don't have the time. Just remember that there are all these other things that people do that take plenty of time and no one ever complains about them, that are school related, because they're important. Why? Because they're important for the students. They're part of the whole experience. They're part of the student becoming an involved member of society who participates, recreation, socially, etc. Next slide, please. So given that, and given that we have barriers about, oh, this takes too much time, what's another barrier that I'm thinking of? I thought a lot about space. And space is a very touchy issue in schools. And there are a lot of things that go on behind the scenes that parents just wouldn't typically be aware of about space and about who has what classroom and who is in this classroom and who isn't in this classroom. And the reason I bring this up is people who take ownership of space can then believe that they have more, I don't want to say authority or more permission or more, maybe more authority to say who's in that space. So for example, before the school year even starts, sometimes the prior year, there are goings on with administrators saying, you know, Miss Smith is going to move from 5th grade to 2nd grade. Miss Sullivan is going to move from special ed this to this. The music teacher is now, usually those aren't, they're not always moved, but sometimes they have no room. I've been in buildings where the specialists have no rooms. They float. It's called floating in and out of the classroom. I've been a floater in and out of the classroom. One year, I'll never forget this. There was an English department in a high school in Howard County, and they had their own little rules about space. There was a lady in her 60s, amazing teacher, beautiful classroom, decorated, just unbelievable. And they're like, oh, she's going to lose her room next year because, you know, next on the list is so-and-so. She needs to go on a cart. And I remember coming up with, well, I'll give her my room because that's not really fair at her age that she's on a cart. I'm telling you all this because there are different school-related policies of who has what space, even who has a desk in the gen ed classroom. I've always advocated for 2 desks if there are 2 teachers in the room because each person needs their planning. They need the students to see that they're a part of the room. They're an educational leader. So again, some teachers believe, and again, this is, you know, whether it's in the staff lounge or whatever, they believe that's their room. So if they believe that's their room, they can believe who or why certain students should or shouldn't be in their space. So before we even get to the IP table, you have teachers who like, oh, I have students on IEPs this year. I don't have students on IEPs this year. We don't have enough room for small group in the back. We don't have enough room for centers. This is the way my desks are. And we have to kind of step back and remind everybody that classroom spaces belong to the children. They belong to the students. And who is paying the salaries of the staff? Taxpayers, you as parents. And if there are teachers listening, of course, you agree with me. These are community spaces. So in terms of when you're at the IP table and they're saying, we can't do this in that classroom. We can't do this in Miss So-and-so's room. They don't have room for, you know, a common corner or whatever. She won't do that. Again, we're like, wait a minute. Who has the authority to say, does the administrator who assigned that room the prior year, they need to step in and go, you know what, Miss So-and-so, you do need a common corner. You do need this. You do need to put supports in place to make sure that students can be included. So that's why I put in a slide about space, because sometimes that sort of for lack of a better word, that sort of, you know, this is my territory. I own this. I'm not budging. These are the students that come in and out. We have to step back and go, wait a minute, next year you might not even be in that room. There might be a different administrator. You might be at a different grade level. That should be flexible. It should be fluid, and students start all throughout the year. Parents move, parents change schools, people move. You need to be flexible. Of course, children are welcome. That's how that should be the go-to. It should be the default should be all children are welcome in the general ed setting. How can we make use of the space to make sure everybody's welcome, whether it's a sensory area, you know, whether there's a bookshelf put up and a student can go sit with his headphones and have some privacy, still obviously under supervision. But we really need to be creative about space if we're creative about welcoming children. Next slide, please. And again, going back to time and that issue of time and assumption about how much time things take, if the problem is that something takes time, that's not actually the problem. The problem is teachers need more time to do that. So if a teacher needs to be released early to take their cheerleading students on a bus trip, they get released early. If teachers need to have extra time to practice for the holiday play, they get that time. So we need to make sure we're allotting the time that's needed for planning for inclusion. That's the problem. Not, we're not going to do it. It takes too long. Forget it. They can just go to a different room. We need to go, wait a minute. Maybe they need to bring subs in and have, once a quarter, a co-planning day. Maybe they need to pay for them to stay after school and go to a co-teaching workshop. We need to be creative and problem solve. And I want to acknowledge, of course, there are staff shortages. I know that, but we still need to say, okay, time is the problem. But is that a reason to just abandon inclusion? No, we need to give teachers more time so they can have effective, deliberate, intentional lesson planning taking place about each student's growth so we can move each student forward. Next slide, please. Okay, I wanted to talk about tips because I've seen different models. I've seen different situations, if you will, different sort of personality challenges and personality successes. I've shared offices with other special ed teachers and hearing sort of like after hours, like why this isn't working in this class, or why this gen ed teacher doesn't want to do this, or why this did work, or this parent said this, or this. So all of the sort of behind the scenes things. We really want to look at what works. We're talking about a couple barriers. We're talking about some assumptions. Okay, what can we do to move forward so that we're like, what does work? What can we do? What do we know? So a couple of things I wanted to talk about that I've really found effective, again, being in 6 systems, and some of it's trial and error. You try that, it didn't work, you try something else. You try talking to the gen ed teacher about, let's try this, and they say, no, I'm not doing that. Sometimes you have to go in the back door and go, well, actually, it's going to work. It worked in this other teacher's class down the hall, and you can go and watch them do it, so it will work. So I want to talk about UDL. UDL is really, really important because it really makes children feel included. I'll give you a UDL example. My last year of teaching, I was in Fairfax County and I was virtual. Many students had breaks on their IEPs, not every student. So I decided, because those classes were very long, very exhausting sometimes, not because, the children couldn't do the work, but being on Zoom 4 times a day for 90 minutes, that's a lot. So of course, many of them have breaks on their IEP. We want to have breaks. So when we get to the next slide, we talk about UDL, giving all students a break instead of, Jimmy, Frederick and James and Antoinette, you have a break. Nobody else gets a break. Just you guys go to the back of the room and get a break. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about UDL, universal design for learning. It's when we put things in place and they're accessible to everybody, and everybody benefits, and those students that need it access it, and those students that maybe don't have an IEP or a Section 504 plan, they still benefit from it, and everybody's included. Graphic organizers placed at tables for any students. I'm a big like artsy craftsy person, and I was always doing my own graphic organizers and looking in a book. So I might do like 4 different graphic organizers. Like if I was doing elementary, I might do an apple, a car, a dinosaur, a building, and I would make like 15 copies, and I would put them at tables, and I'd put them on the shelf and say, graphic organizer, take one if you need it. And someone will be like, oh no, all the students will get used to that. That's a crutch. You know what you found? You found the students really enjoying a graphic organizer. A lot of students see a blank page and that's a trigger. They can't write anything. But when they see a graphic organizer, it's fun for them. They can color it in if they want. They can use a Sharpie. So again, a graphic organizer. And then many of them are like, no, I'm good. I want to use a Chromebook. No, I just want to write. So even the ones that had it on their IEP, sometimes they're like, no, I'm good. And then others are grabbing it. So you have students going, I'm not the only one that needs and uses a graphic organizer. Wow, I'm not alone. I'm included. Another one is reading aloud the text of the entire class. Again, you might think, 9th grade English, they don't want to be read aloud to. Guess what I have found? I think it's an amazing behavior management strategy to read to the entire class. We would take turns. And I don't mean for me to call on people and do like a round robin reading. I mean for adults. And sometimes you will have those eager beaver students that raise their hand. They're like, I want to read next, Miss Capone. I want to read next, Miss Jenks, or whoever I was co-teaching with. I want to read it. Okay, you want to go ahead and read a paragraph, but I would never, just as a rule, just as an aside, I don't go, okay, we're going to round robin read. I'm talking about when an adult reads it, we preview the vocabulary, we do a really high interest sort of what am I trying to say? A very high interest sort of hook activity at the beginning. I remember I did a lesson one year. I was actually teaching in a hospital, and we did a unit on crime and punishment. And I wrote down some different punishments, and I gave out cards 1 to 10, and I had the students come up and place a card by the most severe punishment and the most, sort of, less severe. And then we had a discussion. So again, it was giving them a card, giving them an organizer, having something they could either write it, they could come up and put a number. But again, I read everything aloud to everybody as a way, and then I read the text on different crime and punishment. I think we were doing a unit in government, and it was on cruel and unusual punishment. And we defined cruel, we defined unusual, and we had different examples of, is solitary confinement. And again, this is for older students. What about no TV? What about no cell phone? And they rated it and they discussed it, and we had visuals. And again, I read it to them. So nobody was, flipping through a book, not able to follow. People could hear, people could get up. Breaks for all students. I talked about that before. And I think some teachers and even some parents are very hesitant about too many breaks. You don't want to give a student too many breaks. And, what if you let them go get water and they take, 15 minutes? And my counterpoint is, what if you let them get water and they take 90 seconds and they get right back to work? What about that? So again, I'm not saying we're going to go and read through every student's IEP and then say, okay, everybody's getting calculator, everybody's getting, Common Corner. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, where can we infuse instruction with some modifications that help everybody? And it doesn't have to be every lesson every day, where students go, wow, I have that in my IEP, but look, my classmate who I don't believe is on an IEP also is using a graphic organizer. Wow, it could be typing their answer on the computer. It could be using speech to text. It could be using any of those tools, where we're giving students an opportunity for either another way to be instructed or be assessed. Excuse me 1 second. I did want to go into a little bit, and we'll get into choice boards in a minute, of differentiating, that's okay, between when we're instructing students and when we're assessing students. Because often I find when teachers are talking about what students can't do in inclusion, they're actually talking about assessments. They haven't even given the student the opportunity to have the instruction before their assessments. And I didn't create a slide on this, but I was thinking about this a lot in terms of, let's just take a skill like multiplication. I've had teachers actually tell me, more than one over the years, that student can't learn to multiply for whatever reason. One told me one time it was because of the student's disability. That student can learn to multiply. And I really wanted to take task analysis and look at, well, what goes into multiplication? When somebody's sitting in an IEP meeting and they're writing a goal and they're saying what a student can't do in the gen ed classroom, it really makes me pause and want to go, well, do you know what the student can do? And have you taught them the skill yet? Because I don't think the teacher's telling me that all those students walking into gen ed are coming in with 100% mastery for every instructional standard. That's not what's going on. So you have to have differentiation. You have to meet students where they are, whether they know a little bit about multiplication, maybe they, had it from their summer school, they had it at aftercare, they were exposed to multiplication. So I was thinking years ago when I had students who had trouble with multiplication, both in gen ed and who were and weren't on IEPs, what is the problem? So when you do task analysis, you go, what can the student do? Oh, they can count. Okay, they can count 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If they can count one group of 6, they can count 2 groups of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, now we have 6 and 6. I might use beans. Maybe I use pretzels if there's no allergy. Maybe I'm using math manipulatives. I might be using pieces of chalk, whatever I have. I'm going to plan ahead. I'm going to have Ziploc bags. I'm going to have, maybe some colored squares, like a red square, a green square, etc. Okay, we have 6 and 6. Okay, how many sets of 6 do we have? We have 2. So we have 2, and you see 6 2 times. Wow, we're starting to think about multiplication. So again, when we're talking about inclusion, when people are at the table going, that child can't achieve that standard, they just can't, that's just too hard, they need to be in small group. I'm going, wait a minute, what can they achieve? Have they been instructed in that, or did you just assume based on a WISC score or Woodcock-Johnson score or a KTA score that they can't do something? So we're talking about inclusion. We're talking about universal design for learning. It's really important we're talking about instruction and giving all students the opportunity to have really high quality instruction and really looking at, well, what can they do and bringing them forward. Okay, we have that student. Now they know that that's a group of 6 and a group of 6, and we're going to do 2 times 6. Maybe tomorrow we're going to do 3 times 6. Maybe tomorrow we're going to do 3 times 4. We're going to bring that student along, and within a couple weeks, they're not only naming and labeling those groups, they're now writing it down. They're now thinking, this is multiplying. This is a pattern of instruction, as opposed to somebody sitting at an IP table going, I know they can't do multiplication. I gave them the pre-test. They, these are the reasons that they can't be. It's almost like people are coming to the table with all the reasons students shouldn't be included without saying they haven't been given the opportunity for instruction. And these are assumptions based on an assessment that may or may not have been given, and they haven't even been given the opportunity to learn. Next slide, please, which is a great segue into choice boards. Choice boards are something I used. I can't remember what year I first started using them. And again, I'm kind of an artsy craftsy person, so I will write my own or I'll type my own. And all a choice board, it's not super complicated. It's very low tech. I like to use between 4 and 6 options when I was still teaching, and I've used this at various grade levels. And it's really an opportunity for students to show their mastery of different things. So I remember we were in English 9, for example, and we were reading a story. We gave the students different opportunities to show their knowledge of the story. Some students were really good at either drawing a picture and putting it in a series and then labeling like a cartoon strip, and there are some great software programs out there, or you could do a manual one for those students that love like the gel pen. Some students are really, really good at looking at a photo and saying what's going on. Or for some students, maybe they have to have 3 or 4 choices and they choose which is the correct answer for what's going on in that photo. Again, they're demonstrating mastery of knowledge of what is going on. And again, that's an assessment and it's valid. Some students are very tech oriented. They don't want to get up and do a presentation, but maybe they could create a couple slides if you gave them some raw materials. You gave them a word bank. You gave them some vocabulary starters. You gave them some sentence starters. You gave them some graphics to choose from. Some students literally are like, I want to do a worksheet. And some maybe they want to record themselves talking about the story. So again, when we're talking about a choice board, you'll see students who make up their mind after an activity. How do you want to show mastery? We can go back to multiplication. Do they want to show mastery by drawing a model of the multiplication problem? Do they want to solve the problem on a calculator and write it down? Do they want to do a math worksheet? Do they want to go to a math center and glue things on and show it and make like a little math journal? Again, having students have the time and opportunity both to make those decisions, and often we need to show them a model. We need to say, okay, here's what a cartoon strip about a different story looks like. There are 4 panels. These are each called a panel. And this is what the character's doing, and this is what they're saying, and they go on. And they might have to think about it, and they might have to look and go, maybe that's what I want to do. I've seen students do this. It's fascinating. They'll think about it. They think they want to do a cartoon strip, and then they end up doing slides. Or they think about I just want to do a worksheet. No, they see their friend making a video, and they want to change. Again, giving them those opportunities to show mastery in different ways, you will see different students rise and other students helping. Oh, I did. Let me show you my cartoon. They're discussing it. You have students walking around the room looking. Wow, I didn't know that student can draw. It's fascinating. I've had several students over the years in different settings, in different age ranges with severe dyslexia. And again, I'm not saying names or systems, who are brilliant artists, like way above grade level for the art teacher rating them. And when their peers see them, wow, they're doing a cartoon strip, and maybe they can dictate the words that go in the when the person's talking, the little bubble that the characters are saying. When they see that student who has struggled with reading rise to the occasion and do amazing art, what does that do for that student, and what does that do for their peers? The next time they have a project and they need a poster or something illustrated, or they're doing, a few years later, they're doing History Day, who are they going to go to when they're working as a group? Again, we're preparing them for work. We're preparing them to work in a team. We're preparing for them to communicate. We're preparing them to take chances, have more agency, and decide, oh, I want to show my mastery using this. I want to do this, and I'm confident in that. And giving them a chance to go, you know what, maybe I don't want to do slides. Maybe that wasn't what I want to do. I want to record a video. This is such an important thing to give these students choices, because so many times in school, they have no choices. They have no choices on SOL, or what they're having for lunch, or what time recess indoor recess is because it's raining, or the PE teacher is out on maternity leave and they have a sub and they're doing a worksheet. So many times we're rushing students. They don't have choices, and they don't have an opportunity to show their strengths and their gifts, because students on IEPs have so many strengths, and we don't always reflect that in there. So this is another really good data point, that they're completing a choice board, that let's look at all the data we're getting from this. They made a decision. So that's self-advocacy. They made a decision on which piece of assessment or which way they wanted to be assessed. They went and chose it. They worked in a group. They saw different models. They started and stopped. They asked questions. All of these things, we can get so much data when a student does a choice board. Next slide, please. Talking about co-teaching. This is always sort of a hot button issue, because unfortunately and fortunately, there's so much variability in experience of the person, willingness to co-plan, willingness to share the stage, if you will, willingness, again, we talked about space. And these are just some of the different models. These are not every single model. These are some of the more frequent models that we see. And sometimes, yes, it is influenced which models people choose and implement based on maybe their personality style or their strengths. As you can probably infer from me, I'm very high energy. I'm very verbal. I want to be doing side by side, but I also want to make sure the gen ed teacher and I, we're both working together. We're not, butting heads of who's in charge and who's not. So it's really important people go into co-teaching and co-planning with that end goal of helping all children. So the side by side is very interesting. I actually was exposed to this as an undergrad at a school I went to for my off-campus study, where they had two professors teaching classes together. And I was like, wow, that's really great. And they had different perspectives. So I'm like, that's great for students. Just like if you go to a workshop as an adult and you see two presenters, you can get something from each person. So again, looking at maybe one instructor is more, focused and strong in one area of instruction, and one is in a different one. When I'm talking about side by side, I'm not talking about talking over people. I'm talking about truly you co-plan, you have a topic. It might be, World War I in US history, and you decide who's going to do what. And again, it doesn't work for every person. I've had co-teaching experiences where it had to be, we did one lesson and the other person assisted, which is the blue. And then I've had one where literally it was lesson by lesson. The person was much more flexible. I've co-taught with various people in various systems, and it really is it's almost like a duo by duo decision. And then you also have, of course, you want to include paraeducators in that discussion and where they fit in. So the side by side in tandem, it could be, okay, we're presenting this new unit. I'm going to introduce the vocabulary. You're going to introduce the characters. We're going to introduce the long-term project. We're going to see if anyone has questions, and we're going to circulate. That's just one example. If it was math, it might be, okay, we're going to talk about how to use the calculator. I'm going to go over here, and you're going to come over and check in with me. And then this person is going to go work. So it's side by side and in tandem. The next one I really like are parallel groups. I've seen this with grammar. I've seen this with math, where you randomly pick groups. The students don't know why they're in the specific group, and then you switch. And so they're trying to figure out, well, why? Well, no, I want to be in that group. And you're going, but everybody's working with the teachers anyway. So you do two groups, and it's similar topics, but not identical. And then when you're done, you switch. And again, certain students react differently to different staff. It gives students an opportunity to work with different staff, and it gives the teachers the opportunity to see the students in small group. I really like stations, but stations do take time, but that's okay, because once they're up and running and you model that with the students, then it works. And some students really, really do well at stations. Some students need the reminder, okay, we're about to rotate. You have 5 more minutes. I really need you to, start finishing up, but it's okay, because we're going to do stations again on Thursday and you can finish up. So really making sure for stations, you might have one teacher at one station, one teacher at another. You might have an independent workstation with an activity that you've already explained, and then you might have like a computer center. I've seen that, and I've seen that done well, because students sometimes like that downtime where they're not listening to an instructor and they're getting to work on their Chromebook or whatever, or they can pick out a book, or they can, work on their project. And again, it has to be very intentional. It has to be modeled. It can't be chaotic. And the students have to know where they're supposed to go and why. And then the teachers, they're kind of doing double duty, because you're obviously working with your station, but you're obviously, of course, keeping one eye peeled for anything, the Chromebook just died and that, and go pick up a different one. So you kind of have to practice sort of those, you have to run interference on what else is going on in the room. And paraeducators can be an amazing support in that situation. The one teacher assist, one teacher lead. I don't want people to think this is gen ed teacher leading, special ed teacher assisting. I really want us to sort of flip the narrative that we really need to be seen. Like I went and took those praxis tests in those gen ed content areas. So I could say to the gen ed teacher, well, yeah, I'm certified in this, I'm certified in MS social studies, I'm certified in HS, whatever. So they know, and I wanted them, I'm like, please, feel free to go get certified in special ed, so that we're competent, we know the subject area, and that the students see us as an instructor, not just a case manager and somebody that pulls them for small group. So I think really empowering special ed teachers to take the role of the gen ed teacher, be in the front of the room, run the whole class. Then any student, again, going back to inclusion, then any student will ask for help. I've definitely had times where I'm pulling a small group out into the hall to reteach something real quick, and a couple other little friends and scholars will be like, can I come with you, Ms. Capone? And we're just literally sitting out in the hall right outside the room. We're like, it's just a reteaching session. Anybody can come. You want to have those opportunities for the one teach, one assist. You don't want students to perceive like that's the teacher, then the special ed teacher is the, only works with so-and-so, only does this, is out every Thursday for meetings, sort of a hierarchical. You don't want that. You want a co-teaching model where everyone's included. And again, what does it take? It takes time. But other things take time. And what do you get, though? The benefits from this. The benefits are when you see students in the hall, they all know you. One year I did 8th grade summer school. It was mandatory for all the students entering 9th. Some students, of course, couldn't take it. It was not a special ed summer school at all. I did that very intentionally. So when I did 9th grade English co-teaching the next year, I already knew every student's name. I had written the lessons by myself in the summer. I had taught by myself in the summer. They knew that my behavior management style. They knew what I was like as a presenter. They knew my areas of expertise if they had like a question about spelling or whatever. So I think we need to make intentional opportunities for teachers in various staff positions to be seen as instructional leaders. It's very important administrators are buying in to inclusion and empowering their staff to be instructional leaders, to present to all the staff, to show them what UDL is, to show them co-teaching. We need to set aside time for teachers to go to co-teaching workshops, etc. We need to be very intentional to make this work instead of throwing up our hands and going, that student can't be in that room, that student doesn't know that standard. We're not saying that as a default for students in general ed, that these students don't belong, they need in a different room. So we need to change our mindset that we automatically think that for students on an IEP with certain test scores. Next slide, please. And so, yes, it requires planning. I just said this, but it also requires we have to be respectful of space, time, resources, and there can't be any predetermination other than they belong. It's really about administrators, like I said, but it's time, but of course it's worth it. That shouldn't even be up for discussion. Of course it's worth the time. Next slide. And it's not just in the classroom, as Lucy shared at the beginning. We're talking about recreation. And recreation, I mean any activity that you want to be in. We're talking about sports teams. We're talking about transition activities, whether it's career fairs, whether it's planning for the career fair, whether it's the students who are the ushers for the career speakers. I've been like a career fair nerd over the years, where some years I'm like, I'm going to get more speakers than anyone. I'm going to call my neighbor's friend, whatever. Have the students be involved. Have them walk the speaker down the hall and talk to them. Have everybody involved. SGA, this is an interesting one. I have to say this. I was SGA advisor one year. The principal told me in a closed door session, and then she was no longer the principal there for a different reason. She said, SGA, Liz, is not the group to save students. I'll never forget that. And of course, being my parents' daughter, is like, of course, I'm going to do the opposite and just not tell you. So I remember literally recruiting students out in the hall who were late to class. They might be written up. And I bet those students are going to be great SGA workers. I bet they're going to do a great job if they're given the opportunity. We have to give students the opportunity. We can't just automatically assume somebody shouldn't belong somewhere. And I may have said this in the last presentation. We were doing the pep rally. I get a phone call. I'm getting ready to leave my classroom to go down to the pep rally early. I get a phone call from an upset teacher. Did you give so-and-so a pass to help with the pep rally today? I can't believe it. I told him I had to call you because I didn't think he did SGA. And I said, yes, I did. He's one of my best workers. So again, that teacher's perception about what that student, and he had some behavior challenges, what he could and couldn't do, don't believe he was on an IEP, is keeping them from being included. He did an amazing job. I had all access passes made for the students. I had them laminated. He came out early. They had an amazing pep rally. So we need to give students these chances. And then lunch and recess. What intentional things are we doing for students to be included in conversations? Because social interactions, that's one of the last areas on the frontier of inclusion that still has a lot of work to be done, as we all know. We need to have more intentional opportunities for maybe staff going in and doing more lunch bunches, for maybe more structured activities at recess, for maybe more pragmatic back and forth conversations. We need to include these students everywhere, not just in the classroom. I always have to put a picture of a confused dog because I think that's just, you know, essential for every slide presentation. This is not the same dog as the last presentation, but I would love to answer any questions anybody has.
Let's do that. And one of the first questions I was going to share with people quickly was just about what a graphic organizer was. And I just pulled up some visuals to show, because it's a visual thing, maybe easier to just show. But as Liz said, sometimes staring at a blank piece of paper is overwhelming, but having some physical grouping, some way to kind of compartmentalize your ideas is a good help. And now we'll move on to some of the other questions we got, which are absolutely fantastic. So we had a few kind of along this line about it, like if a child is significantly impacted by their disability, significant behaviors, or really far behind in school, is inclusion still an option? How do we work to keep them on grade level with typically developing peers?
That's a big one. And again, I think some people that say the least restrictive environment for every student is the gen ed setting. Maybe at that time for that student, that isn't where they're able to be for different reasons. I've taught in various settings. I've taught in a residential treatment center. I've taught in an acute hospital. For that time period, that student needed certain supports to then be able to have that toolkit to move them back to general ed where they belong. But for that time period, maybe a student is in crisis. Maybe they're having a, mental health issue, or their behavior has not yet turned around. For if they're in a large setting and there are a lot of sensory issues, maybe they're not there all of the day. They don't have that skill set yet. So it could be, when we're looking at instruction and instructional needs and achieving, and again, this is speaking in general without speaking to any specific student, but we're looking at what can we duplicate instruction wise from that small group. Like I said, what's magically going on in there that we can put back in general ed. Behavior is a little more challenging because they could be having some challenges where they're not able at that point yet to access the general ed curriculum right then. And sometimes we don't know why. It can be, I've seen students with, later we found out they had PTSD, they had a traumatic brain injury, whatever, but they were not safe in that large setting because maybe the furniture, maybe they were not able, they needed a smaller setting with less sensory I don't want to say stimuli. So at that time, they weren't available for accessing the gen ed curriculum. That doesn't mean that we say you're going to be in this setting for 3 years or 4 years and we're not moving you back. What can we do? What can we help them with? And how much time can we give them? But again, having taught in residential, taught in a small group setting, those students had been on the continuum, and for whatever reason, different things happened along the way. And by the time they got to residential, many days I was glad they were showing up at my door outside because they lived there. And I'd say, thank you for coming and sitting outside my door. That's where you are today. I appreciate it. You can hear my lesson from the hallway. And as long as there's somebody supervising them. And again, our goal would be to discharge them back to their neighborhood school, back to gen ed. They were just not there yet. So what supports did they need? Maybe they needed counseling. Maybe they needed a functional behavior assessment to find out, was the work too hard? Was it boring? Was that classroom? Was it the lights? All of those factors to find out what can we mitigate and adjust. So maybe at that moment in time, they're not able to access the full inclusive environment, but we want to give them the tools to move towards that. That's a very difficult question because it's so individualized and so many factors, especially with students coming off of virtual learning. A lot of these students, their in-person time now, they're behind on adjusting to in-person routines and things. So they're really at a disadvantage. So they're just now learning the norms. That's a very, very sensitive and difficult question, but we have to look at it as in a situation by situation conversation.
Absolutely. And we got some great compliments here about your words about freedom and room to breathe and ways to shine, right? And how all students need that, and how we had a family whose daughter just really thrived after her SGA experience. So it just makes me really happy to hear those kinds of things. And something that I wanted to share quickly before we go on to other questions is, I started as a case manager in the Medicaid waiver system for people with disabilities before iPads existed. And I remember when they came online and we went from people with disabilities needing a $7,000 2-ton stinking Dynavox to carry around as a communication device to being able to have iPads. And Liz, to your point about using the same tools and how that rising tide lifts all boats, right? How when we all have access to those tools, it doesn't single you out as a person with a disability. And sometimes it's a greater way for all students to learn. We're just in an incredible place in history with tech access and how iPads and phones and all kinds of things that are also adaptive equipment are very hip. And I feel like we want to take advantage of that tremendous advantage that we have right now that was not the case not very many years ago. We had a good question here about your thoughts on the role of an instructional assistant, because often they're used to be one child's teacher for the course of the day, right? That really is segregation within a classroom.
It's really interesting because I've worked with some amazing, unbelievable. There was one woman come in. She's a friend of mine. If you could picture a combination of Lauryn Hill and Marilyn Monroe, that's my friend. And she sashayed in with her cape, and she was a one-on-one. And I was like, oh, we're either going to get along great, or she's getting her PhD now, and she's amazing. And she's a behavior specialist for a county in Maryland. She's just an amazing person. And again, I look at making sure the students know that's another staff person who's here to help you. You should view them as your teacher. I'm not going to dump a bunch of work on that person. When I was still teaching, you're going to go write this IEP and cover, and I'm going to 2-hour lunch. We really have to respect the role of the instructional support staff and their expertise. Some of them are, former teachers, retired teachers. Some of them have, a child in another grade level and they want to be able to be at school. There's so many different reasons people come into the classroom, but I always make sure I'm including them in my planning. Many school systems do not have instructional support people viewing IEPs. I want to make sure, with respecting confidentiality for the students, et cetera, that they know what they need to know and that they're included. And when I was teaching virtually, there was one person, and I made this, the students, I would make sure when I did my lesson planning, very intentional, I would have, well, okay, we're going to do a small group, and I would plan with the I had specific planning time with the instructional assistant during our planning. Like we had Mondays, for example, and we had specific, and then somebody later in the year was like, I think we should plan with the instructional assistants. And I was kind of like, I've been doing that. But at any rate, it's like, of course, they're an adult to be respected and included, but we also have to make sure they're not given the responsibility of what teachers are required to do in their contract in terms of instructional standards and the teacher of record, et cetera. So that's a very sort of gray area, fine line, loosey-goosey area, because I've seen classrooms, remember one distinct classroom in 2002 where the behavior management of the classroom teacher was just not there yet. Let's just say that. It was a charter school in DC. I was there for a year. I was both the coordinator and the teacher because of staffing. And when that instructional assistant walked in the room, those students were like, it was like a military procedure. They were sitting. When the teacher, who had a master's degree in the most decorated room and came in early and she literally could not control the class. God bless her. And the kids were literally running wild. So again, you saw the administration, and I tried to help her, and we tried modeling, but the instructional assistant was viewed by the students as higher in the pecking order, somebody to be taken seriously, somebody who knew more, had more experience. And then you had a first-year teacher who met well, very smart, certified. So you see that dynamic too, and you really have to be careful, because then it's like, who's the teacher, who's the assistant? So we have to make sure we're sharing the space and sharing the responsibility, but that person isn't handed a packet saying, go teach this. Because again, they're probably like, it's almost like a substitute, like, oh, I have to figure out what's the objective. What am I teaching? Has the student been taught this? And again, this is something that I had Dr. Cummings at Hopkins told me, and it was credited to somebody else. We have to make sure we are delineating between when we're instructing a student and when we're assessing a student. If we're instructing, that student is learning new information. If we're assessing, they are completing something that's showing us what they know. And I feel like sometimes in some buildings, what I've seen is an instructional assistant is basically handed a packet and told to be an end-all and be-all of the instructor and the assessor. And the student hasn't had a chance to have the instruction, to have an actual lesson. And that's asking too much. They should be then paid more and given a different title. Because you're right, it has to be, and if somebody's in that position where they are being the teacher, that has to be a difficult conversation with the administrator. That it's like, if that's asking me to direct the band and I'm not qualified or able to do that, that's not in my position description. I need some more support. Who's supposed to be doing what? And really drilling down, asking for a position description. I wrote 1-year position descriptions for IAs in one building because nobody had them and there was a lot of confusion. So really finding out, what is each person's responsibility? And then that helps clear things up, I think.
All right, I think we can maybe squeeze in one more question here. And this is a question from a mom who's got multiple kids at a school where his siblings also go. And this little guy is on the autism spectrum and is non-speaking, not a verbal communicator, and has intellectual disabilities. So how do we start to work through inclusion where we know most likely he's not going to be able to access a lot of grade level curriculum?
It's interesting when I've worked with students with, I don't want to say similar profiles, who've had some of those, same strengths and needs. We have to again look at what we know and what we don't know and how we get more information. Whether it's a student using a communication board, whether it's a student who is able to point to a response, whether a student is able to choose between two responses. There was an amazing fifth grade teacher one year in Howard County, and I wrote a separate lesson plan for one of the students for the whole day. And she always had a smile on her face, and she always said, let's just call the student, Freddie, that Freddie's welcome in here all day, every day, but I know sometimes he might need a break. And I remember just how amazing it was to you could tell when the student would say, he had a one-on-one and he would tell me, Miss Capone, let's go for a walk or let's go for a break or whatever. So again, how much instruction, and we did a lot of co-planning. So if we're doing something on, the continents, or we're doing something, okay, what can they listen to? What can they hear? How can we assess them? And really drilling down and doing that task analysis to, okay, maybe we have to swap out some of those pictures on that communication board for, which lesson do they want to do? Do they want to do this, that? Start with what they can do and move them forward, and incrementally moving up. And of course, exposing to a lot of lecture time, exposing them to peer behavior, exposing them to lunch and recess, and then moving them forward as much as possible. Maybe working in a small group, still in the room. But that's challenging, but we still have to move forward and identify strengths. We still have that responsibility, and we can still do it.
Yay. Oh God, what a perfect note to end on, though it kills me that we're not getting to all of our questions, but I will certainly follow up with folks once our recording is posted. And if you're watching this later, you can always go to the arcofnova.org/answers and ask for help accessing the slides or the recording. But please do follow up with Liz directly. She's a tremendous advocate and expert, and we are so grateful that you were here today with us. Thank you so much, Liz.